Imagine stepping into a medieval marketplace, not the clean, tiled supermarkets of today with humming refrigerators and fluorescent lights. Number. Think of dirt beneath your boots, the kind that clings with every step. Think of stalls made of rough wood, patched together with rope and nails, their awnings sagging under the weight of dust and smoke. Now breathe in. The air is not gentle, it is thick. It swirls with odours so strong they almost sting the eyes. Blood, fat, animal dung, the acrid bite of smoke from open fires, and underneath it all that faint, sweet, sour whiff of rot that no one could ever truly escape. This was the heart of life. Markets were noisy, chaotic and alive, but also dangerous. Every cut of flesh hanging from a hook was locked in battle with time itself. There were no blocks of ice to keep things cold. No insulated vans bringing food in from far away. No humming freezers lined with glowing shelves. The butcher's only weapon was speed. And for every shopper, the same question lingered. Was this meat fresh enough to keep me alive? Because in the Middle Ages, meat was more than food. It was wealth. It was prestige. It was nourishment in a world where bread and porridge filled most stomachs. But it was also risk. A gamble. To eat meat was to flirt with decay. Everyone knew how quickly it spoiled. A slab of beef left under the midday sun could sour before evening, its colour shifting, its scent turning from rich to foul. And once that smell appeared, danger followed. Rot was invisible until it was undeniable. Parasites, unseen bacteria, creeping corruption. These lived in the fibres of the flesh. A bad cut could sicken an entire household. In crowded towns, it could spread through families, neighbours, guild halls. The consequences were not small. People died from meat that had been fine just hours before. And so the marketplace was not just a place of trade, it was a stage of suspicion. Shoppers sniffed cuts, pinched edges, pressed their fingers into the flesh to test its resilience. Trust mattered more than price. To buy from an unfamiliar butcher was to risk more than coin. It was to wager your family's safety. For the poor, the gamble was harsher. They could not afford the prime cuts that nobles or wealthy townsfolk snapped up quickly. By the time their turn came, the freshest flesh was already gone. What remained might already carry the sour tang of age. They bought anyway, because hunger left no choice. Greyish meat, tinged with spots, perhaps a little slimy to the touch. These scraps still ended up in their stews. Illness became a companion in poor households, an accepted risk. To live at the margins meant sometimes eating what you knew could kill you. Medieval chroniclers knew this fear well. They wrote of it in tones both resigned and alarmed. Stories survive of towns where entire gatherings fell ill after a feast, where spoiled meat crept past the senses until it was too late. Even in times of plenty, food was fragile. To eat flesh was never simply to enjoy flavour, it was to gamble against decay. So how did people cope? How did a society without refrigeration manage to keep meat on the table day after day? The first solution was as obvious as it was brutal. Immediacy. Animals were not slaughtered far from sight and delivered on neat trays. They were brought alive into town, penned in noisy corners of the marketplace, bleating and squealing, waiting for the butcher's blade. At dawn, the killing began. By mid-morning, carcasses hung from hooks, skinned, gutted, steaming in the cool air. By noon, cuts were being hawked to shouting crowds. By evening, most of it was gone. This rhythm was deliberate. Freshness was not luxury. It was survival. The faster an animal moved from life to the cooking pot, the safer it was. Town markets were even designed to make this seamless. Pens for goats, pigs, or cattle stood close to the butcher stalls, sometimes just a few steps away. The system allowed butchers to kill, clean, and display in a single flow. From life to flesh to sale, all in one morning. Shoppers too adapted. They did not come to stock up for weeks. They came with the expectation of eating that very day. Families bought enough for a single meal or two, rarely more. Leftovers were rare, not because they were disliked, but because they were dangerous. Meat left overnight could betray you by morning. Imagine the soundscape. In the early hours, the cries of goats and pigs being led to slaughter, the metallic clang of cleavers on bone, the calls of sellers hawking their stock. For many, this noise was the reassurance of survival. The squeal of an animal was not cruelty in their ears. It was the sound of a day's meal secured. Cooking, too, was shaped by this urgency. Medieval recipes rarely called for slow curing or careful waiting. They were designed to transform raw flesh into safe food quickly. Boiling, roasting, stewing, all were efficient fire-driven methods to beat back the dangers of rot. Soups and stews in particular served double purpose. They could stretch small cuts of meat further, and the boiling heat was a kind of insurance policy against sickness. Even symbolism attached itself to this immediacy. Freshly slaughtered meat meant more than just flavour. It was purity. It was trust between the butcher and the buyer. It was vitality, the essence of life transferred into food. To eat fresh was to eat safe, and to eat safe was to live another day. But this rhythm came with costs. It tied communities to daily slaughter, to constant vigilance. It allowed little room for delay, little room for planning ahead. Every meal was a race. Every dinner table was a victory against time. In a world without refrigeration, survival was not stored in pantries or larders. It was purchased fresh, cooked quickly, and consumed before decay could claim it. And this was only the beginning. For medieval people knew they could not always rely on speed alone. Not every season permitted constant slaughter. Not every family could buy fresh every day. There had to be other answers, ways to push back against the relentless march of rot. Immediacy kept people alive from day to day. But medieval life was not only about the present moment. What about winter, when markets slowed? What about long journeys, soldiers on campaign, sailors at sea, pilgrims walking for months? Survival demanded more than speed, it demanded preservation. And so, across Europe, people turned to their oldest ally, salt. Salt was not merely seasoning, it was salvation. Grain by grain, it carried the power to hold back death. In many lands, salt was rarer than gold. Wars were fought over salt mines. Kings levied heavy taxes on its trade. Caravans dragged it across deserts. Ships hauled it along coasts. Without it, meat was fleeting. With it, flesh could last for weeks, even months. The science was not known to them, but the practice was. Salt pulled moisture from flesh. Without moisture, the tiny unseen agents of decay, the worms, the bacteria, the moulds, could not thrive. A haunch of pork rubbed in salt turned from soft to firm, its fibres tightening, its juices drying. It was no longer fresh, but it was safe. Picture a soldier in the mud of France opening a barrel of salted beef. The meat is leathery, stiff, and pale. It smells sharp, almost bitter. It must be boiled before eating, sometimes soaked overnight just to make it chewable. But it fills his belly and keeps him alive. Imagine a pilgrim trudging along a dusty road, carrying a pouch of salted pork at his belt. Each strip is hard as wood, but it can be gnawed slowly, a taste of home far from safety. For households, a small supply of salted meat meant security. A family could face the dead of winter knowing that food waited in the cellar. The taste was harsh, the texture tough. Children chewed it with effort, yet it was security in its purest form, meat that defied time. Salt was more than a preservative, it was a symbol. To hold salted meat in your hand was to hold endurance, foresight, preparation against hunger. But salt was not the only weapon. Smoke, too, was a guardian. Where fire had cooked, now fire also preserved. Huts of timber, their roofs blackened with soot, served as smokehouses. Families carried their cuts to these places, hanging them from rafters above slow, smouldering fires. The smoke drifted upward, clinging to the flesh. day after day, week after week, the meat grew darker, denser, tougher. The fire did not only dry it, the smoke itself carried unseen powers, antimicrobial compounds that slowed rot. The result was transformation. Pork became ham, sausage became a hardened coil of strength, fish became strips of smoke-darkened flesh, ready to travel, ready to last. Entire villages smelled of it, the deep, almost sweet perfume of oak or beech smoke. Each wood lent its own flavour, a kind of local signature. To eat smoked meat from one region was to taste the forest itself. In towns, larger smokehouses worked on a greater scale. Near castles, monasteries or bakeries, the haze of preservation poured day and night. Armies marched on smoked supplies. Monks survived long fasting seasons with smoke-cured stores, and peasants too found strength in their own small huts, where the daily fire did double duty, warming, cooking, preserving. The process was not perfect. Smoked meat was tough, sometimes nearly as hard as bone. It had to be boiled or stewed back into softness. But toughness was a small price. Every chew was reassurance. The alchemy of smoke had turned fragile flesh into endurance. In its haze, people found security. To taste smoked ham was not only to eat, it was to bite into survival itself. Still, even salt and smoke had limits, so people turned to the chemistry of the kitchen: vinegar, wine, and spices. Vinegar, sharp and biting, slowed decay when meat was soaked in it. It changed the very fibres, making them softer, sometimes sour, but more resistant to rot. Wine, too, carried this property. It was not just drink for the wealthy. In noble kitchens, wine was poured over cuts, turning preservation into luxury. What for the poor was harsh necessity, vinegar became, for the rich, refinement. To serve wine-marinated meat was to serve both safety and status. And then there were the spices. Imagine the journey. Peppercorns from India, ginger from the east, cinnamon and cloves from the islands of the spice route. Each grain had travelled across deserts, seas, and empires. By the time they reached Europe, they were treasures, worth more by weight than silver. For most, they were untouchable. But for nobles, spices offered both disguise and display. Because spices did more than flavour. They masked. Meat beginning to sour, meat with faint traces of decay, could be turned aromatic, layered in rich complexity. Guests at a noble feast might never know what lay beneath a veil of pepper and clove. The scent of spice became not only delicious but deceptive. To serve heavily spiced meat was to serve confidence, to show wealth, and to hide decay in the same dish. Cookbooks from the Middle Ages read like rituals of concealment. Instructions layered flavours upon flavours, ginger with pepper, cinnamon with clove, vinegar with wine. These were not only recipes, they were strategies designed to disguise the fragility of flesh. For the wealthy, food became theatre, spices became actors, masking what could not be preserved forever. For common folk, the play was simpler. Garlic, thyme, sage, humble herbs from gardens and fields offered some freshness, some protection. They lacked the strength of pepper or cinnamon, but they flavoured the pot, gave the illusion of health, softened the bitterness of age. Even in simplicity there was defence, and then came winter. Nature itself became the preserver. In the north and east, when the cold descended, meat froze solid in the air. Carcasses hung like stone outside cottages, safe until thawed. In villages near the Baltic or the Alps, survival meant trusting the season itself. For nobles and monasteries, ice was harvested. Men cut great blocks from rivers and lakes, hauling them into straw-packed ice houses buried deep in earth. These primitive freezers could last months, their treasure of cold stretching into spring. Imagine opening such a storehouse. The air is damp and chill, the walls packed with straw. Blocks of ice glisten in the dim light, and beside them cuts of meat preserved by winter's hand. It was luxury of the highest order, meat weeks after slaughter still safe. But the seasons turned. Spring thawed the ice, warmth returned, and so people returned again to salt, to smoke, to vinegar, to spice. Winter gave reprieve, but never permanence. Every method had its limits. Every method demanded labour, cost and attention, and yet together they formed an arsenal. Salt, smoke, sourness, spice, and snow. These were the guardians of medieval flesh. They were the tools by which people carved survival from a world eager to rot. And yet, even this was not enough. For meat, dangerous as it was, carried not only the risk of nature, but also the risk of people. The butcher who sold it, the market that displayed it, the guilds and councils that claimed to guard it. Preservation was not only physical, it was social. And this too had to be managed. For all their efforts, speed at the block, salt in the barrel, smoke in the rafters, sourness in the pot, winter's ice in the cellar, people knew one truth: failure was never far away. Because meat was too valuable, too dangerous, and too central to leave to chance. And so society turned to another form of preservation. Not chemical, not natural, but human. Law itself became a weapon against rot. Medieval towns were not lawless sprawls of stalls. Councils, guilds, and rulers knew well the risks. A single bad cut could poison dozens. A dishonest butcher could endanger an entire market. And so, ordinances were written, posted, enforced, in London, Paris, Florence, Cologne. Wherever markets swelled with people, inspectors prowled. They were called meat viewers in some towns, guild brothers in others. Their task was plain: to look, to sniff, to cut into the flesh, and judge. Was the meat fresh? Was it sound? Or was it treacherous? Punishments for deception were not light. A butcher caught selling spoiled meat might be fined. He might be forced to display the foul cuts as public shame. He might be beaten. In some cases, he could lose his license, his livelihood cut off like the very animals he slaughtered. In a trade built on trust, reputation was life itself. One stain, one act of greed, and a career could vanish. Guilds policed their own as well. Butchers' guilds held strict codes. They knew that the failure of one could taint the name of all. A market depended on faith, that the meat was safe, that the price was fair, that the buyer would not be betrayed by rot hidden beneath spice or smoke. Why so harsh? Because markets were tinderboxes of trust. One suspicion could spark riots. Chroniclers describe unrest when people believed they had been deceived. In crowded towns where plague already loomed, where filth already seeped into water and air, the idea of corruption in food was unbearable. Law was not just about safety, it was about peace. To protect a meat was to protect the fragile balance of community. And yet, even with law, even with salt and smoke and spice, failure was constant. Preservation faltered. Not every family could afford barrels of salt or the luxury of wine. Not every village had a smokehouse. Not every winter froze deep enough to last. For the poor, especially, spoiled meat was unavoidable. Imagine a peasant woman at a stall, her few coins clutched tight. The fresh cuts are already gone, claimed by those with heavier purses. What remains is pale, grey, a little slimy at the edges. She knows, she smells it. She feels the danger in her bones. But she cannot go home empty-handed. Children wait. Hunger presses harder than fear. She buys it anyway. She boils it long, stirs in herbs, adds onions to disguise the scent. The stew is bitter, but it fills bellies. That night some will clutch their stomachs in pain. Some may not see the morning. Communal feasts too sometimes turned into calamities. A wedding, a festival, a gathering where meat was stretched to feed hundreds. The poorest cuts, the oldest stock, the spicier sauces to hide the flaws. People feasted, sang, drank. then fell sick in waves. Chroniclers wrote of fevers sweeping through villages after such events, of deaths that followed laughter, all because the line between nourishment and poison was so thin. And yet, hunger did not care. To waste food was unthinkable. Even meat already soured was eaten, stews heavy with garlic, sauces pungent with mustard, anything to hide the taste, anything to quiet the stomach. For the wealthy, spices masked decay with glamour. For the poor, herbs masked it with desperation. In both cases, the truth was the same. People ate what they feared. Spoiled meat was more than misfortune. It was a symbol of poverty's cruelty. To be poor was to be forced into decay. To chew it was to know your own fragility, to taste the edge of survival every day. The rich had barrels of salt. The poor had risk. The gap was carved in every bite. Yet in all this struggle, something larger was happening. Medieval people were not only fighting rot, they were shaping the very culture of food. Salted pork became not only survival, but tradition. Even today, bacon and ham carry echoes of those barrels. Smoked fish, smoked sausage, still staples, still beloved. Once born not of choice, but of necessity. Vinegar and wine still flavour our kitchens, remnants of their dual role as preservers and enhancers. Spices, once worth fortunes, now commonplace, still whisper of a time when they disguised danger as luxury. And the laws? They never vanished. Food safety ordinances, government inspectors, expiration dates on packages, all are descendants of medieval meat viewers and guild rules. The fear of spoilage still guides us, even if it is hidden now in sterile aisles and humming refrigerators. Think of it. Walk into a modern supermarket. Glass doors slide open, shelves glow beneath cold light. Packaged meat rests neatly, labels declaring safety, dates of guaranteed freshness. You push a cart, you choose, you barely hesitate. You do not sniff or press or fear. Because refrigeration has won, and yet behind that victory there is continuity. Every packet of bacon, every smoked ham, every jar of pickled meat, every sprinkle of salt is a ghost of the medieval struggle. Their battle is still on our plates. For them, it was never just food. It was a war with time, rot, and death itself. They fought with salt and fire, with sourness and spice, with law and punishment. Sometimes they won, sometimes they failed. But in their struggle, they laid the foundation of how we eat today. So the next time you taste bacon, or season with salt, or stir vinegar into a sauce, remember, you are tasting the Middle Ages. You're tasting not just flavour, but survival. Every bite is an echo of their battle, a quiet triumph over decay. And the story of medieval butchers reminds us of something simple, yet profound. Every meal we enjoy today is not just nourishment. It is the victory of centuries, a victory over rot, over time, over death itself.